staying in the Western portion of Christianity during the Middle Ages, I want to say a few words about what is called scholastic philosophy. Now, scholastic philosophy is really what we call the kind of blending of the Christian faith and philosophical reasoning, especially during the Middle Ages. You have a lot of very well-trained academics who are theologians, but who also want to think more philosophically about the Christian faith. Obviously, they don't want to fall into the trap of Arius by depending too much on logical reasoning and not trusting in divine revelation. But they do want to discuss or engage with the idea of the possible harmony between what we can discover through our own reasoning, which is seen as a gift from God, and what we discover about reality from divine revelation. And they want to discuss how these two, in some ways, sources of knowledge, sources of truth, can interact with each other, can perhaps support each other. And I just want to mention a couple of these important medieval scholastic philosophers and focus really only on one particular issue, which is the philosophical approach to the belief in God's existence. And we see each of these theologians, philosophers, engage in that type of argument. So to begin, let's talk about Anselm. Anselm is one of these scholastic philosophers, and he does very famously get remembered for an argument that seeks to, if not prove, at least support a belief in God's existence. And it's an argument from reason alone. That is, he's not just turning to the Bible and saying, hey, look, in Genesis 1, it says that there's a God. That means there's a God. No, he's actually, in some ways, bracketing off the Bible for now in order to think rationally and philosophically about the idea of God. And what he's ultimately going to say is that our reason can actually help support the Christian belief in God's existence, because our reason, if we think clearly enough, will lead us to the conclusion that there is a God. And for him, that gives greater support to the Christian faith, and that allows the Christian faith to show its compatibility with human reasoning or philosophical reasoning. Now, Anselm's argument, for which he is most remembered, about the existence of God is called the ontological argument for God's existence. Ontology is a field within philosophy that simply is about the study of being. That means it's very abstract, it's vague, right? It's not moral philosophy, which is the study of how we interact with others through our actions especially. It's not epistemology, a study of how we know, and therefore a study of knowledge. This is ontology, the study of being, right? This is where you ask questions like, what does it mean to be? Why is there something rather than nothing? What is existence? These are really vague, abstract questions. And obviously, we can't go completely into this understanding of philosophy or this approach within philosophy in such short videos, but I at least want you to get a sense of how he's using ontology in order to make an argument for God's existence. So when you read Anselm's ontological argument, he's basically playing a kind of mental game with his reader. And he's thinking about ideas or words that can be put together to form ideas, and whether those are ideas that our mind can accept, or whether there is something inherently contradictory about that idea that forces our minds to reject that idea. So, for example, I could tell you to go home and to think about a squared triangle, or a squared circle might be a better example, right? When we think of a square, and you think of a circle, to think of a squared circle in just common sense terms is a paradox. It is an oxymoron. Those words don't go together. We know what a square is. We know what a triangle is. But to think of a squared triangle or to think of a triangular circle, these things don't actually make sense as ideas within our minds. And Anselm is going to say, okay, I've got an idea for you, and I want you to tell me if it works in your mind. Can you think the idea that I'm about to say to you? And he offers what I've typed here as this idea, that than which nothing greater can be thought. And Anselm says, can you think of that idea? Or is it like a triangular circle? Or is it like 2 + 2 = 5? Yes, we know what those individual words mean, but those ideas taken in their entirety are rejected by our minds. Is this rejected, or can we think the idea of that than which nothing greater can be thought? And Anselm expects you to say, well, yeah, there's nothing contradictory about these terms. You're just talking about the greatest possible thing. That doesn't mean that right away I know how to describe it or I can list all of its attributes, but he expects you to say there's nothing inherently contradictory or oxymoronic about those words being put together. You are just talking about that than which nothing greater can be thought, the greatest possible thing. And here's where Anselm makes his little move. He says, if you can think this idea, then the thing than which nothing greater can be thought also must exist in reality, outside of your mind. That is, if you can think of this perfect thing inside of your mind, if you can have the idea of the perfect thing, then that thing must exist outside of your mind in reality. And of course, he's going to say, when Christians speak about God, they are referring to that than which nothing greater can be thought. Right? That's what God is. That's who God is. God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. God is perfect being. And for Anselm, if you can think the idea of God in your mind, then you've already committed yourself to believing that God actually does exist, not just as an idea in your mind, but in reality, external to your mind. So how does he make this little move? He says that existence is necessarily better than non-existence. This is why this is ontology. It's a study of being. If you're going to be a perfect thing, then existence is better than non-existence, meaning existence must be one of your attributes if you are that than which nothing greater can be thought. Right? Because otherwise, if the idea in your mind of that than which nothing greater can be thought exists only in your mind, then for Anselm, that really can't be that than which nothing greater can be thought. There would be one thing greater, the same thing you're thinking of, but which also has necessary existence in reality. I know this gets pretty intense and abstract and a little bit difficult to follow, but just think of this game that he's playing with his reader. Right? He's saying if you can think the idea of God in your mind, the perfect being, then part of what would make that being perfect is necessary existence. Right? Everything else in reality has a contingent existence. Right? I only exist because of other things that have happened that lead to my existence. But that's a certain level of imperfection because I'm not in control of my own existence. If you are going to be perfect being, then necessary existence must be one of your attributes. This is why Anselm thinks that if we can think the idea of God, or of that than which nothing greater can be thought, then we've already committed ourselves to believing that God truly exists. For Anselm, when the atheist says God does not exist, that doesn't make sense. That's like saying there's a triangular circle, right? It's oxymoronic to say that God does not exist. Anselm would say, I don't know who you're talking about when you say that sentence, but you're not talking about God. Because if you were talking about God, you're talking about perfect being. And perfect being necessarily exists, or else it's not really perfect being. It would have the imperfection of non-existence. Okay? So it's an interesting little move he makes. And certainly there are others who try to poke holes in what he does. There was even somebody very quickly after his ontological argument was made public who tried to poke holes in it. His name was Ganilo. And Ganilo said, okay, fine, I'll play your game, Anselm. I've got an idea for you. An island than which no greater island can be thought. Can you think that idea in your mind? And I think we would have to say, well, sure, I can close my eyes right now and I can think of the perfect island, right? Palm trees, nice waves coming in, white sand, right? Scantily clad men or women, whomever you choose. You can think about your own version of the perfect island, right? Does that mean that that island also exists outside of your mind? Well, no, right? Sadly speaking, the women that I'm picturing in the sand and the waves does not exactly exist somewhere in the Pacific Ocean right now, right? Just because I can think the idea of a perfect island doesn't mean that that perfect island must exist. And for a lot of people, that seemed to close the door on Anselm's ontological argument. But it's important to recognize that a lot of very important philosophers and theologians, for many centuries following Anselm, even to this day, still believe that there's something to that ontological argument. After all, Anselm wasn't talking about a type of thing like an island. He was talking about perfect being itself. And people like Descartes and John Locke and others will come back to that ontological argument because they still see it as convincing in giving at least support for the Christian belief in God's existence. So the Christian doesn't have to feel that he or she is being irrational when believing in God, because reason can actually seem to support a belief in God's existence. Again, we have a lot of debates as we continue on through time between theists and atheists, but I want you to at least see some of what was happening in the Middle Ages with scholastic philosophy in trying to show the compatibility between faith and reason. Right? Another important figure here is Aquinas. Now, Thomas Aquinas becomes incredibly significant, especially for the Roman Catholic Church. He's considered the doctor of the Roman Catholic Church. Very important theologian, philosopher, academic. And Aquinas, when he discusses rational arguments for the existence of God, puts forth what he calls the 5 ways or the 5 proofs. We won't go through each of them in detail, but the 5 proofs generally are about looking at the world around us and then drawing conclusions based on what we see. So this isn't quite the same as Anselm, who's playing a mental game with his reader. Aquinas was influenced by Aristotle. And Aristotle, unlike in some ways Plato or the Neoplatonists, was much more interested in natural observation rather than abstract thought. So Aristotle and now Aquinas, they want to look at the world and then draw conclusions. So for example, one of Aquinas's 5 proofs is the argument from motion. And the idea is that when you look out around you, you see things are in motion. But Aquinas says everything that is in motion had to be put in motion by something prior. But that thing would have had to have been put in motion by something before it. And it doesn't make sense to go back to infinity, so there must be a first mover. What even Aristotle called an unmoved mover, a first mover, a prime mover, something that actually started the process of motion. And Aquinas says that's what we Christians mean when we say God. God was the one who began motion. There's an argument from change, an argument from cause and effect. Again, he's trying to show from the natural observation of the world that there is rational support for a belief in God's existence. It's important to recognize that with Anselm and Aquinas, you're not getting support necessarily in believing in the Trinity. Right? That, they will say, you're going to need revelation, right, to come to a true knowledge of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But they are trying to show the rational consistency in believing in a creator God, a first cause of existence. And they believe that that's important to show how reason can support something like the belief in God's existence. Okay? The last of Aquinas' 5 proofs is often called the teleological argument. Right? See if I can type that word in here. The teleological argument for God's existence comes from the Greek word telos, meaning the end or the purpose. And the idea is that everything has a purpose. Everything has an end, is designed for something. And Aquinas says when you look out at the world around you, you see how everything is working so well together, and there are intricate connections in the way that the universe is functioning. And he says it's not possible to imagine how the universe is working in such an intricate way without believing in some sort of creator of the universe. Right? A later thinker, William Paley, will bring up this argument again. He'll call it the watch argument, like a wristwatch. And he will say, look, if you're going out into a field and you stumble across a rock and you look at the rock, you might be able to believe that that rock just somehow came into existence, no real design given to it or anything like that. But if you stumble across a Rolex and you take it apart, this wristwatch, and you look at all of the springs and the dials and all these things, he says there's no way that you can believe anything other than that there is a watchmaker. And Paley, following Aquinas, says when you look at the universe, It's a hell of a lot more like a watch than a rock. And the intricacy of what we see in the world around us demands a belief in an intelligent creator of the universe. Now, again, as we move through time, we have people who attempt to refute these arguments, others who find them convincing. For our purposes, I just really wanted to mention scholastic philosophy, especially when it comes to arguments for the belief in God, just to show the way in which during the Middle Ages, you have a strong focus on trying to show the compatibility between the Christian faith, some of its most important beliefs, and philosophy, or human reasoning, on the other hand. And we see that with both Anselm and Aquinas as great examples of scholastic philosophy in the Middle Ages.